Hi everybody, this is Johnnie. I'm sharing this workbook for the edTPA. You can find this workbook for your own use in a link below in the description. This workbook is Literacy Assessment Task 3 and it's the commentary. In this workbook I'm going to be sharing all the prompts. I will share some descriptions too about things to think about with each of the prompts and offer starters for every one of the prompts. Lots of good starters. So let's get started. Literacy Assessment Commentary. In Literacy Assessment Task 3, you will write a commentary responding to the prompts below. Your commentary should be no more than 10 single-spaced pages, including the prompts. Attach the assessment used to evaluate student performance, no more than 5 additional pages, and, if necessary, a transcription of inaudible portions of a video or audio clip of feedback or a student work sample, no more than 2 additional pages, to the end of the literacy assessment commentary. These additional pages do not count toward the commentary page limit noted above. So let's get started with the first prompt. Analyzing student learning. Identify the specific learning objectives measured by the assessment you chose for analysis. And this is plainly define those objectives that clearly can be seen in student work on the assessment. So some starters. The specific learning objectives measured by the assessment are, and then just go ahead, set out learning objective you analyzed in the assessment. Again, if there's another, and you continue adding as makes good sense for this. So specific learning objectives, right? And those should be tied both to the essential literacy strategy and to the related skills, all right? Not things like has good handwriting. It should be very much about the literacy objectives you have for your learning segment. Let's go to B. Provide a graphic, table or chart, or narrative that summarizes student learning for your whole class. Be sure to summarize student learning for all evaluation criteria submitted in Literacy Assessment Task 3, Part D. So you're going to set out all the criteria that you've set out. And these should show up in your table, chart, or narrative. So you have a choice here. You could choose to write a narrative describing evidence of your students' learning based on your criteria. You will need to describe what criteria your students met, what criteria they are beginning to meet, and what criteria they clearly are not meeting. I suggest that it is probably better to set out a rubric showing how your students did based on your evaluation criteria. There are some examples below, and we'll go over them in detail. You can see that the criteria are clearly set out. You can see that the essential literacy strategy and related skills are set out in the criteria. You can see that the number of students at each level of understanding are set out. Okay, so here's an example. Evaluation criteria. These are the essential literacy strategies related to opinion writing, and this is about related skills. And over here you can see the number of students that met, that are proficient, students who didn't quite get there, and students who did a bit more. And this is an example of a strong table. Here is how you might go about this. You might start with a description of your table. My table shows the following evaluation criteria, followed with a list. Students were evaluated according to the criteria, and then use your own levels. So it could be emerging, proficient, exceeding. So proficient might also just be use the word meeting. That's a useful one to have in your criteria. I have included the numbers of students I evaluated at each level. So you might set this out as a paragraph before you share the table. And this might be a way you organize your table. The criteria on one side, and then the levels and numbers of students at each of those levels. Here's a second example, much simpler. Essential literacy strategy, related skills, central focus. This one is fine, but it's not going to be as much to write about that follows. The main thing about these tables is that they set you up for the next prompt. In the next prompt, you're going to be writing about what you understand about your students based on this rubric and how students did. So you want this to be something you can write about in the following prompt. So this is example 2, much simpler. And this is example 3. Okay, very simple. I'm still going to say that you should work towards this strong example with good explanatory criteria here. This is the best way to go. There's one other way you might go, or you might do this in addition to the rubric. You might also set out how each of the students did relative to the evaluation criteria. This is useful for 2 reasons. The first is that you can identify clusters of students who did well or did not do well on any one of the criteria. The second is that this sets you up to write about specific students with particular understandings or needs, to identify your focus students. So in this case, instead of using bundles of students, this person said about each student. Student A, B, and C are the focus students, and then following students, students were labeled A, B, C, D, E, F, G. Student 1 and student 2 were labeled separately. So in this case, instead of showing how many people did well by sequencing, this person decided to show a score for sequencing for every one of the students. And as we look at this, we can see that student 1 did pretty well but struggled with grammar, did well on pictures with an average. We can see that student D did not do as strongly across all of them, so we might want to think about that. The other way to look at this is to see which criteria are stronger and weaker. So for instance, pictures, there were a number of 4s. But if we look at grammar, there were a number of 2s. So maybe you want to write about what happened with grammar and talk about how well they did by pictures. So this is more of a line item analysis. Okay. And so these are examples of the tables a table you might use for this task. And again, this is the strongest one. Let's go to C. Use evidence found in the 3 student work samples and the whole class summary to analyze the patterns of learning for the whole class and differences for groups or individuals relative to, and the 2 essential literacy strategy related skills. Consider what students understand and do well and where they continue to struggle. This one has a lot going on here. You want to be thinking about the 3 student work samples and the whole class. And for the 3 student work samples, what patterns of learning were there? For the whole class, what patterns of learning were there? And then you also want to consider differences for groups or individual learners, according to what they did well and what they struggled with. So it's quite a lot here. Do give attention to each part. Patterns of learning is most important. Do not skip this part. Patterns of learning will show up in one of the rubrics. Let's start with whole class. For the whole class based on work samples and your summary table above, think about what students understood and did well across the whole class relative to the essential literacy strategies or related skills. Okay, this is whole class. What students continue to struggle with, common errors, confusions, or need for greater challenge relative to the essential literacy strategy and related skills. Okay, so this is whole class. The first part is what they understood and did well, and the other one is what they struggled with. Okay, whole class, did well, struggled with. Here's some starters for you. The essential literacy strategy. As can be seen in my assessment summary, describe a criterion where many students did well. Students did well by this criterion as part of the essential literacy strategy. I noticed this pattern of learning. Consider sharing something you saw across students' work. Okay. And then you continue. As you can see in my assessment summary, describe a criterion where many students struggled. Students had some misunderstandings connected to the essential literacy strategy. I noticed this pattern of learning. Consider sharing something you saw across students' work. Okay, so essential literacy strategy, you're thinking about your whole class, and you're thinking about what they did well, here, and here you're talking about what they had struggled with. Okay, so the essential literacy strategy. You can see it's going to be parallel. After essential literacy strategy, you're thinking about the whole class now in terms of related skills. Most of my students did well by the related skills of, and give names. This can be seen in the assessment summary where we can see. So go back up to the table, and I'm going to zip up there. If you go back up to the table, you can see where students struggled. Okay, so which piece of this did they struggle? And you say how many students struggled. Describe the information in the table that shows most students doing well in related skills. I noticed this pattern of learning. Consider sharing something you saw across students' work. So the first part is what you see in the table. Okay. Second part is what you see in students' work. So this is all evidence. So related skills, and this is what students doing well. So they know the parallel is with related skills. A good number of my students struggle with the related skills of, and give names to them. This can be seen in the assessment summary where we can see, so looking again at the table, kids who aren't quite meeting the proficient level. Describe the information in the table that shows most students struggling by the, and describe the related skills. And then again, I noticed this pattern of learning. Consider sharing something that you saw across students' work. So we talked about doing well. We talked about struggling. We talked about sources of evidence, can be seen. And we're also talking about patterns of learning. Right? So everything you need is in these starters. And so this was all about whole class. Okay. Let's go to groups of students. For groups of students based on work samples and your summary table or narrative above, this is what you should do for groups of students. What students understood and did well across the whole class relative to the essential literacy strategy and related skills. Again, groups of students doing well. What students continue to struggle with, common errors, confusions, or need for greater challenge relative to the essential literacy strategy and related skills. Okay, and this is the struggle. And we're going to have to address both the essential literacy strategy and related skills. So here are starters. It's going to have a similar form as before. Use these as you need. So for groups of students, essential literacy strategy. As can be seen in my samples of student work, one group of students did well by the evaluation criterion. Name the criterion. This expectation was important to the learning of the essential literacy strategy. I noticed this pattern of learning for this group. Consider sharing something you saw across students' work. Okay? And so you're being specific about something they did in their work and did well by. And then the next piece is about the struggle. As can be seen in my samples of students' work, one group of students struggled with. Describe a criterion where many students struggled. This group had some misunderstandings connected to the essential literacy strategy. I noticed this pattern of learning. Consider sharing something you saw across this group's work. Okay? So the first part up here was did well by, and patterns of learning with the essential literacy strategy. This is about struggles my students struggled with, and something about the essential literacy strategy, and then you want to talk about patterns of learning. So we've done essential literacy strategies for groups. Now related skills. A group of students did well by the related skills of, name them. This can be seen in the assessment summary or student work sample. So you can use one or the other or both, where we can see, describe the information in the table that shows this group doing well by related skills. I noticed this pattern of learning. Consider sharing something you saw across students' work. Okay, so related skills, what they did well by, and then pattern of learning for related skills. A good number of my students struggle with the related skills of, name these. This can be seen in the assessment summary or again student sample work, where we can see, describe the information in the table or work that shows the group struggling by the, and describe the related skills. I noticed this pattern of learning. Consider sharing something you saw across students' work. So for related skills, we've talked about what they did well by, and then continue with related skills, a pattern of learning with related skills, what they struggled with, the evidence being in the assessment summary or student work sample, and then you write about patterns of learning. And lastly, for individual students based on work samples in your summary table or narrative above, you want to think about what students did well by across the whole class relative to the essential literacy strategy and related skills. And you want to write about what students continue to struggle with, common errors, confusions, or need for greater challenge relative to the essential literacy strategy or related skills. Okay? Same form as we did before. Starters, essential literacy strategy. As can be seen in the sample of student work, name the sample. One student did well by the evaluation criterion. Name the criterion. This expectation was important to the learning of the essential literacy strategy. I noticed that this student consider sharing something you saw in the student's work. Okay, so you have to have evidence. As can be seen in this sample of student work, name the sample. Now we're thinking about the struggle. One student struggled with, describe a criterion where the student struggled. This student had some misunderstandings connected to the essential literacy strategy. I noticed that this student consider sharing something you saw across this student's work. Evidence again. So this was essential literacy strategy, what they did well by, and then the second one is what they struggled with, essential literacy strategy. Now let's think about related skills for individuals. One student did well by the related skills of, and name these. This can be seen in the assessment summary or student sample work, where we can see, and you want to describe the information in the table that shows this student doing well by related skills. I noticed this in their work. Consider sharing something you saw across students' work. So this is related skills and what they did well by. And to continue for the other part of it with related skills. One student struggled with the related skills of, name. This can be seen in the assessment summary or student sample work, where we can see, giving evidence. Describe the information in the table or the work that shows the student struggling by the related skills of, and then name these. I noticed this in their work. Consider sharing something you saw across students' work. So there's a lot to this prompt. Let's go back up to understand why it's so complicated. You have to have evidence, so this is from student work or from the whole class summary in the table above. You need to talk about patterns of learning, and you need to do this for both the whole class and differences in groups or individual learners related to essential literacy strategy related skills, and you need to be talking for each one of them about what they did well and what they continue to struggle with. So that's why there's so much here for each one of the groups. Hope this will be helpful to you. So let's go to D. This one's pretty straightforward. If a video or audio work sample occurs in a group context, for instance, a discussion, provide the name of the clip and clearly describe how the scorer can identify the focus students. So what position, physical description, and for whose work is being portrayed. If your assessment is shared in the form of audio or video recording, you need to make clear who the focus students are. And you need to name them focus student 1, focus student 2, focus student 3. Let's go to, so that one's pretty straightforward. Let's go to 2 now. Feedback to guide further learning. Refer to specific evidence of submitted feedback to support your explanations. Identify the format in which you submitted your evidence of feedback for the 3 focus students. Choose one of the following. Written directly on work samples or in separate documents that were provided to the focus students, in audio files, in video clips from Literacy Instruction Task 2, provide a timestamp reference or in separate video clips. And further, if a video or audio clip of feedback occurs in a group context, for a discussion example, Clearly describe how the scorer can identify the focus student. So what position, physical description, who is being given the feedback. Okay? So my suggestion is you best to give evidence of feedback from both, feedback written directly on students' work, and this has to be more than just good job. This has to be about what they did. I really like how you started the topic sentence off clearly to get the paragraph going. It is good that you took time to reconsider what vocabulary might be used in this sentence to make it a stronger sentence. This is very specific to the learning goals of your lesson and related skills. So the other one is, and this one should show up in your videos, live feedback, spoken during instruction and evident in your video clips. Okay? So in your video clips, you can be showing how you're in conversation with your kids about their work. That's why it's very important that you have somebody go around with the camera, with whatever you're recording with, as you meet with students. Don't just have the video recording device in a corner and you're off in the other corner of the classroom having a really good conversation with your students, because you won't be able to hear it and it won't be good enough for this task. So imagine a peer or your mentor teacher moving around with the camera as you meet with small groups. Kids are working independently, as you're sitting at a table and having conferences with students. So you need to make it evident in your video clips, okay? And audio matters a whole lot. And as I said, feedback needs to be more than good work, needs improvement. Feedback should be about the learning objective. You need to have a clear topic sentence to start this paragraph, or when you retell the story, remember to describe what makes each character special. So I hope that's helpful. You want feedback that addresses both strengths and needs. Here's some starters. So feedback on student work. I provided specific feedback to my students on their work. On, describe the work you gave feedback on. I gave feedback on, describe the learning. An example of the feedback I gave to a student describing a strength in their work was, this feedback acknowledges that the student is showing good understanding of the essential literacy strategy related skill. So you're justifying your feedback and you're connecting it back to your learning objectives. Continuing, I provided specific feedback to my students on their work. On, describe the work you gave feedback on. I gave feedback on, describe the learning. An example of the feedback I gave to a student describing a need in their work was, this feedback acknowledges that the student needs to reconsider their understanding of the essential literacy strategy or a related skill. So you're doing strengths and you're also doing needs. Okay? So this is things that you would write on students' work. During video, this is feedback given during instruction on video. During my instruction, I gave specific feedback to my students. My students showed me strength in and described what that strength was. As can be seen in video clip number at timestamp, I offer feedback on students' strengths by, describe what you did to affirm students' work or ideas. This feedback acknowledges that the student is showing good understanding of the essential literacy strategy or related skill. Okay? So this is video and you're showing a strength. During my instruction, I gave specific feedback to my students. My students showed some misunderstandings in, so this is the other side. As can be seen in video clip number and timestamp, I offer feedback on student misunderstanding by, describe what you did to move students to reconsider their work or ideas. This feedback acknowledges that the student needs to reconsider their understanding of, and then discuss the essential literacy strategy or a related skill. So, all about feedback here. You want to identify the format, so you've got talk about, you're going to write about the work that you're doing and giving feedback directly on their work samples and video clips. You could do this in audio files as well. And you want to give evidence about your feedback. And these prompts should help. Let's go to B. Explain how feedback provided to the 3 focus students addresses their individual strengths and needs relative to the learning objectives measured. So feedback, strengths, and needs. My suggestion is you write 1 paragraph for each of the 3 focus students. And again, you want feedback that addresses both strengths and needs. So here's the starter for focus student 1. I give focus student 1 feedback on describe what the student was doing, work sample, or in a video clip with timestamp. This feedback addresses a strength the student is showing in, and then describe the strength and how it connects to the essential literacy strategy related skill. So that's all about a strength. I give focus student 1 feedback on describe what the student was doing, work sample, or in video clip with timestamp. This feedback addresses a need the student is showing in. Describe the need and how it connects to the essential literacy strategy or a related skill. So again, we need to be thinking about each of the 3 focus students, the feedback that you offered, and strengths and needs. So in these prompts, you can see the starters. This describes what that feedback was, that it was a strength, and how it mattered. And for the other feedback, you describe what the feedback was, why it was important, and how it addresses a need. So a strength and a need for focus student 1. And you know what comes next. Focus student 2, you're going to do the same thing, a strength, and you're going to describe what that feedback was. You're also going to be talking about the feedback for something that was maybe not so good, they need some help with. So you're going to give some direction feedback on a need. So focus student 2, a strength and a need. And as you would expect, focus student 3, a strength and a need tied to descriptions of what they were doing. Right? Let's look at C. Describe how you would support each focus student to understand and use this feedback to further their learning related to learning objectives, either within the learning segment or at a later time. Now, keys to this is about support, but you're supporting 2 things. First, you're going to support them to understand, and then you're going to support them to use. So you might start by restating the feedback you gave to each of the 3 focus students from above, and then you need to address both for each focus student. How you will support students to understand the feedback, and how you will support students to use the feedback. Okay, support to understand, support to use. Here's some starters. For focus student 1, I will support focus student 1 to understand the feedback related to their strengths by describe how, talk through the feedback, show students how to. I will support focus student 1 to understand the feedback related to their needs by, and describe how, talk through the feedback, show student how. These are examples, okay? I will support students to use the feedback by, describe how, give them time, give them a workspace, offer a peer partner, assistance from an aide, offer tools or resources. So in this case, for focus student 1, understanding the feedback related to their strengths, and so that may not need to have a use, support their use for that one, but with their needs, the feedback that you give for their needs, you need to talk about how you're going to support them to use that feedback. Okay? And I've given examples here. So some of the needs might be like talk through the feedback. So if you're going to support them to understand, talk through the feedback with them, show them how to do something that's supporting them to understand the feedback. But to support students to use the feedback, think about some strategies like giving them time, give them a workspace, offer a peer partner, assistance from an aide, offer tools or resources. Okay, so this is focus student 1. And so the shape of this one, where you're talking about understanding strengths and then understanding needs and supporting students to use the feedback, it's going to be the same for the others as well. You'll see focus student 2, understand their strengths, understand their needs, support students to use. Focus student 3, understand their strengths, understand the feedback related to their needs, and then supporting students to use the feedback. Okay, so let's go back up here. How are you going to support students to understand the feedback you've offered, and how are you going to support students to use this feedback? And it's best if you could address each one of the focus students. Let's look at number 3. Evidence of language understanding and use. When responding to the prompt below, use concrete examples from the video clips and/or student work samples as evidence. Evidence from the clips may focus on one or more students. You may provide evidence of students' language use from 1, 2, or all 3 of the following sources. First, use video clips from the Literacy Instruction Task 2 and provides timestamp references for evidence of language use. 2. Submit an additional video file named Language Use of no more than 5 minutes in length and cite language use. This can be footage of one or more students' language use. Submit the clip in Literacy Assessment Task 3, Part B. 3. Use the student work samples analyzed in Literacy Assessment Task 3 and cite language use. So you see the choices. Use the videos you already have, submit an additional video file, or focus on the student work samples. Here's the first prompt. Explain and provide concrete examples for the extent to which your students were able to use or struggled to use the language function, vocabulary, or key phrases, and discourse or syntax to develop content understandings. My suggestion, give attention to all 4: language function, vocabulary and key phrases, discourse, and syntax. So some definitions here. I'm going to read them. First, language function. Using information about your students' language assets and needs, identify one language function essential for students to develop and practice the literacy strategy within your central focus. Listed below are some sample language functions. You may choose one of these or another more appropriate for your learning segment. And these all came up in the planning task and the instructional task, so you should have this in mind already. For vocabulary, includes words and phrases that are used within disciplines, including 1. Words and phrases with subject-specific meanings that differ from meanings used in everyday life, like table. Table means something in the house, and table in math means something different. 2. General academic vocabulary used across disciplines. So thinking about literature or thinking about math, you can have compare, analyze, evaluate. And 3. Subject-specific words defined for use in the discipline, like trigonometry. Next is discourse. Discourse includes the structures of written and oral language, as well as how members of the discipline talk, write, and participate in knowledge construction. Discipline-specific discourse has distinctive features or ways of structuring oral or written language, text structures, that provide useful ways for the content to be communicated. In the language arts and literacy, there are structures for composing, interpreting, and comprehending expository, narrative, poetic, journalistic, and graphic print materials, as well as video and live presentations. If the language function is to interpret character development, then appropriate language forms could include written essays with particular ways of citing textual evidence, or pattern sentences such as, the author used, action, dialogue, and/or description, to introduce, main character. One example of, action, dialogue, and/or description, was suggested that the character was. And last, syntax. The set of conventions for organizing symbols, words, and phrases together into structures, how language is organized so that it can be understood. All right? So the next piece is you want to remember to address both what they were able to do and what they struggled with. And this is again across these 4. What they were able to do and what they struggled with. So let's see what we have for starters. Language function. In considering the language function, name the language function, many students were able to describe what they were able to do. This can be seen. Describe where to find this in student work or in video clip number at timestamp. What I see in their work related to the language function is, this is where you explain how you see what they were able to do successfully. So this is about being able to. You got to think about what they struggle with too. In considering the language function, name the language function. Some students struggle with. Describe what they struggled with. This can be seen. Describe where to find this in student work or in video clip number at timestamp. What I see in their work related to the language function is, this is where you explain how you see what they struggled with. So this is language function. What you saw with evidence. First what they were able to do with evidence, and then what they struggled with evidence. So that's language function. Vocabulary and key phrases. Again, it's going to be a similar structure. Vocabulary and key phrases. In considering vocabulary and key phrases, name the kinds of vocabulary and key phrases many students were able to. Describe what they were able to do. This can be seen. Describe where to find this in student work or in video clip number at timestamp. What I see in their work related to vocabulary and key phrases is, this is where you explain how you see what they were able to do. So same structure as before. This is vocabulary and key phrases, what they were able to do. The parallel is going to be what they struggled with. In considering the vocabulary and key phrases, name the kinds of vocabulary and key phrases some students struggle with. Describe what they struggle with. This can be seen. Describe where to find this in student work or in video with a video clip at timestamp. What I see in their work related to the vocabulary and key phrases is, this is where you explain how you see what they struggled with. Okay, so that's vocabulary and key phrases. Discourse is going to have the same structure. Discourse. In considering the discourse of the lessons, describe features of the discourse. Many students were able to. Describe what they were able to do. This can be seen. Describe where to find this in student work or in video clip number at timestamp. What I see in their work related to the discourse in the lessons is, this is where you explain how you see what they were able to do successfully. And to continue, in considering the discourse in the lessons, describe features of the discourse some students struggle with. Describe what they struggle with. This can be seen. Describe where to find this in student work or in video clip number at timestamp. What I see in their work related to discourse in the lessons is, this is where you explain how you see what they struggled with. Okay, again, so discourse, what they were able to do, what they struggled with, and you need to have the evidence. Lastly, syntax, same structure. In considering the syntax features of my lessons, name the syntax features. Many students were able to. Describe what they were able to do. This can be seen. Describe where to find this in student work or in video clip number at timestamp. What I see in their work related to the syntax features is, this is where you explain how you see what they were able to do successfully. So we're able to do. Let's get to struggled with in syntax. In considering the syntax features of my lessons, name the syntax features some students struggle with. Describe what they struggle with, and then continue. This can be seen. Describe where to find this in student work or in video, and then give reference to the video clip number and the timestamp. What I see in their work related to the syntax features is, this is where you explain how you see what they struggle with. So pay attention to each piece of this. We start back here at language function. You're doing each one of the four: language function, vocabulary, discourse, and syntax. And for each one of them, you start with what they were able to do, with evidence, and then what they struggled with evidence. And that meets all the requirements of this prompt here. Explain and provide concrete examples for all of these. Okay? And you have to think about what they were able to do and what they struggled to do. So let's go to the next prompt. This is 4. Using assessment to inform instruction. Based on your analysis of student learning presented in prompts 1B to C, describe next steps for instruction to impact student learning for the whole class, for the 3 focus students, or other individuals or groups with specific needs. And there's definitions here: folks with IEPs, 504 plans, English learners, struggling readers, underperforming students, gifted students. So in this one, it's all about next steps for instruction, but you need to address at least 2 groups, the whole class, and then the 3 focus students and other groups as well. So these 2 have to happen. Here's my suggestion. Go back to your responses to prompts 1B and 1C. Consider where students still have misunderstandings or did not meet the criteria set out for their learning. These are the topics that you should consider for next steps. So look across the folks that were emerging, did not quite meet your criteria. That sets you up for thinking about what the next steps should be. And a question for you: what could you do in future teaching to improve their learning in these topics? And then breaking it down, you want to address each. Next steps for the whole class, next steps for focus student 1, next steps for focus student 2, next steps for focus student 3, and next steps for learners who need different strategies. So here's some starters for you. Whole class. Based on my analysis of student learning that I presented in prompt 1B, I believe a next step for instruction for the whole class should be, okay, so describe that. I believe this next step will have good impact on student learning for the whole class by, describe how the next steps build on the learning students engaged in during your learning segment. So both are about whole class. You're connecting this to evidence, why you want to be doing this next step, and you're giving a justification for why you want to make this change. So that's whole class. And you're going to do the same for each of the focus students too. Focus student 1. Based on my analysis of student learning for work samples described for prompt 1C, I believe another next step for instruction for focus student 1 should be, and you're talking about focus student 1 now, and why this focus student needs to have this change made for them. I believe this next step will have good impact on focus student 1's learning by, describe how the next steps build on the learning students engaged in during your learning segment. So this is focus student 1, and this is very particular to a change you need to make because of something they showed you in their work, okay? In their work sample, or maybe it's in video. As you might imagine, focus student 2 is going to have the same form, okay? Something from their work sample, a next step for instruction for focus student 2, and then what you believe this will do for them. Continue with focus student 3, same thing. What evidence do you have that needs to be a change? Why you think this might be a good thing, what this should happen for them, and the good impact it should have on their learning. So let's go back up to the prompt. Okay. Describe next steps, whole class, 3 focus students, or other individual groups with specific needs. You can use the same frame. Focus student 3, you can say for students with individual needs. For my student with an IEP, you can use this same frame to address how you would make a change for them. Let's go to B. Explain how these next steps follow from your analysis of student learning. Support your explanation with principles from research and/or theory. Okay? So next steps need to be connected to something, like why you're going to be doing these, and then why the changes are, how the changes are connected to what you understand from research and/or theory. And I'm going to say you will likely repeat what you wrote in 4B above. This is all right. What you want to do here is connect to research or theory. So let's think about the whole class. The next steps for learning for the whole class, describe them again. I believe the next steps for the learning for the whole class, follow my analysis of student work. In my analysis, I found, describe the learning that sets up your next steps. Based on this, I believe that the next steps I set out make good sense. So this is the analysis and justification part for your next steps. But now you need to think about theory. These next steps fit with, give a citation here on learning theory or literacy teaching theory. This theory sets out what is a general idea that matters from this theory. Based on this theory, my next steps make good sense because. Okay, so you set out what the next steps are, you describe this coming from your analysis, and then you connect to theory. And then you want to use the same frame for the focus students. Best to describe more than just one. The next steps for learning 4, you choose one. Let's say focus student 1. From my analysis will be, describe it. I believe the next steps for, let's say focus student 1. Describe, follow from my analysis of their work. In my analysis, I found, describe the learning need that sets up your next steps. Based on this, I believe the next steps I set out, name the steps, make good sense. And then again, theory now. These next steps fit with, give a citation here on learning theory or literacy teaching theory. This theory sets out what is a general idea that matters from this theory. Based on this theory, my next steps make good sense because. So you can do this part here with this frame here for each of your focus students or for your students with particular learning needs. All right, so use this again and again. And here, for students with particular learning needs, choose at least one, same frame, the next steps for learning, and you describe, and then you say why you believe this matters for them, and describing why they make good sense. And then for the students with particular needs, then you want to finish with connecting to learning theory. Okay, so we made 3 blocks here. Whole class, we described what the next steps would be, we talked about the analysis, and then we talked about theory for whole class. Same for this one, next steps, the analysis, and then about theory, and then students with particular needs, next steps, your analysis, and then theory. Let's go back up to the prompt. Okay, explain how the next steps follow your analysis of student learning, and then you want to connect to principles from research or theory. So these starters should help you well with these. Okay, so that's all for the prompts. Let's give some attention to the rubrics. This is rubric 11, analysis of student learning. How does the candidate analyze evidence of student learning related to the essential literacy strategy and related skills? Level 3 says, this is the level you want to work towards at least, the analysis focuses on what students did right and wrong, and analysis includes some differences in whole class learning. So based on this, these are some requirements to reach level 3. Your analysis should describe what students did right, what learning objectives did they meet. Your analysis should describe what learning objectives students got wrong, describe what learning objectives students got wrong, did not meet, or still struggle with. That's pretty straightforward. And then the last one, the last piece here, your analysis should describe patterns of learning for your whole class and for groups. All right? They're not saying patterns of learning here, but that's the idea here. So treat this one as having 3 elements to complete. To move to level 4, your analysis uses specific examples from work samples to demonstrate patterns of learning consistent with the summary, and patterns of learning are described for the whole class. So for this one, it's all about patterns of learning. So let's start. To get to level 4, evidence. Give evidence from work samples that exemplify the patterns of learning that you describe in your analysis. Example, this pattern of learning can be found in, you can use this as a starter, focus student 1, 2, or 3's work here. Also, describe a pattern of learning for the whole class. That's the last piece here. This has to be a pattern of learning for the whole class. A pattern of learning I found for the whole class was, and that gets you to level 4. Let's go to rubric 12. This is, what type of feedback does the candidate provide to focus students? Focused on feedback here. And for level 3, feedback is specific and addresses either needs or strengths related to the learning objectives. Either needs or strengths. So you have a choice here, but you really want to try to address both. These are necessaries. Your feedback is specific, focused on your learning objectives, not just simple praise or about superficial features of their work. Your feedback addresses student needs based on learning objectives. Your feedback addresses student strengths based on learning objectives in literacy. Treat this one as having 3 elements to complete to reach to level 3. So level 4, just a bit more. And this, if you do all of these, you will get to level 4. Feedback is specific and addresses both strengths and needs related to the learning objectives. To get to level 4, this is simple. Do both. Strengths and needs based on learning objectives. Strengths and needs. That takes you to level 4. Let's go to rubric 13. How does the candidate support focus students to understand and use the feedback to guide their further learning? This is about the feedback, and again, it's about understanding. How do you set them up to understand the feedback? How do you set them up, support them to use the feedback? So for level 3, candidate describes how focus students will understand or use feedback related to the learning objectives. So it's not asking for both, but you try for doing both. So based on that, you will need to describe how you will make the feedback understandable to your focus students. Just giving feedback is not enough. So how are you following up to make sure that they understand what to do with the feedback? And then you will need to describe how you will support your focus students to use the feedback. Okay? So that's level 3. Level 4, candidate describes how he will support focus students to understand and use feedback on their weaknesses or on their strengths or weaknesses related to the learning objectives. So notice that you have strengths, weaknesses, both of these in terms of feedback. In level 3, they didn't describe what quality of feedback, but for level 4, it's strengths or weaknesses. So to get to level 4, the emphasis is on how you support students to use the feedback you offered. Describe the guidance or follow-up you offer students as you give them feedback. And it's best to describe how you will follow up on both strengths and weaknesses. That's the main thing here for level 4, strengths and weaknesses. It's very plain in the prompt that you should address that. So that's rubric 13. This is rubric 14. How does the candidate analyze students' use of language to develop content understanding? So if we start here with level 3, candidate explains and provides evidence of students' use of, and you'll see that you have to do the language function and one or more additional language demands. So you have only one of these that you need to get to level for level 3, vocabulary or syntax or discourse. So language function and then one of these 3. So requirements, you need to describe how your students were engaged in using the language function. And I'm going to suggest you try to do all of them. You need to describe how students were engaged in using vocabulary. You need to describe how students were engaged in the discourse that mattered to the learning segment. And you need to describe how students were engaged in the syntax that mattered in the learning segment. So think about this as having 4 things to do. And these will set you up for level 4. Candidate explains and provides evidence of students' use of, so you have to do language function, and you have to do vocabulary, language function, vocabulary, and here you have to do either discourse or syntax. So in level 3 you had 2 requirements, level 4 you have at least 3 in ways that develop content understandings. To get to level 4, give attention to all 4, the language function, vocabulary, discourse, and syntax. That takes you to level 4. There's one more rubric. This is rubric 15. How does the candidate use the analysis of what students know and are able to do to plan next steps in instruction? All about next steps. So for level 3, next steps propose general support that improves student learning related to assessed learning objectives. Okay. Next steps are loosely connected with research and/or theory. So my suggestions, things to do: set out next steps for the whole class to improve learning based on learning objectives. Right? That's a little beyond just general support. Set out next steps for your focus students to improve learning based on learning objectives. Okay, so this is more folks, not just something for the whole class. Set out next steps for IEP, ELL, challenge students to improve learning based on learning objectives. So more folks again, next steps for more folks. And connect your next steps to learning theory strongly. Okay, it says loosely here. So level 3 is very vague, kind of general support, improve student learning, it doesn't say for whom, and some loose connections to theory. If you do these 4, you'll be in a much stronger place. Treat this one as having 4 elements to complete. For level 4, next steps provide targeted support to individuals or groups to improve their learning relative to the essential literacy strategy related skills. Next steps are connected with research and/or theory. Notice that it's not vague here about who needs to have the support in next steps. You need to have targeted support, and you need to have absolutely clear connections to research or theory. So to get to level 4, be specific about how the next steps target some misunderstanding or need for individual students, your focus students, groups of students. Give good attention to connections to theory throughout, and that'll take you to level 4. So this was rubric 15. We've done all the rubrics. We have one last piece for this. So here's an exemplar, an example. Somebody did really well with this one. It's a strong example. If yours is 80% the quality of the one below, you will be fine. Pay attention to how the responses are absolutely specific to the prompts. Notice how key terms from the prompts are woven into the responses. So writing to the prompts and using the language of the prompts are both good ideas. Let's get started. This is prompt 1, identify the specific learning objectives. And you can see this describes the formative assessment, and the assessment measured students' ability to write a strong beginning, stretch out small moments, and describe sensory details. So those are the learning objectives, also connected to the standards. The second piece, this one says provide a graphic or table or chart. And as I shared before, this is a good way to do it. You can see in this, the criteria over here are related to the essential literacy strategies and the related skills. You can see approaching, proficient, exceeding. Proficient means met the learning goal. And you can see the number of students that met each of these levels. So you can see for this one, strong beginning, lots of kids did well by this. Stretches out small moments. Most kids are okay here, but quite a few kids weren't or just approaching, and only a couple kids did better than expected. So, and then finally, sensory details. Lots of kids struggles with this one. Half the class is approaching in sensory details. So you can see the strength of this table, and based on this, let's look at C. Evidence in the 3 student work samples and whole class summary. Analyze patterns of learning for the whole class and differences for groups or individual learners related to these. Essential literacy strategy and related skills. You can see that this person is marked very clearly where essential literacy strategy came up again and again in students' work. Essential literacy strategy. Also related skills. Every place that you see orange right now, this is where they describe related skills. And this is from 3 student work samples. So you can see student 1, student 2, student 3 describing who they are, and thinking about the whole class summary, whole class, whole class, whole class. You'll also see that there are numbers that are used from the table above, and those numbers give more indication of patterns of learning. But you can also see there are places where patterns of learning are explicitly given attention. So Lots of things to have to work on C, but here's a good example for you. For 2A, identify the format. And this person wrote down here, the format in which I submitted feedback for the free focus students was through written feedback provided on separate documents. So straight answer to a very straight prompt. For 2B, this is explain how feedback provided to the three focus students addressed their strengths and needs. Okay, so a general description of the three focus students and strengths and needs. And you can see down here, student 1, needs, strengths, needs. Focus student 2, strengths and needs. Focus student 3, strengths and needs. If we go to C now, describe how you will support each focus student to understand and use the feedback. Here's focus student 1, understand and use the feedback. This is how this person will support them, and acknowledging how they're going to be doing this. And then it's focus student 2, understand and use. Here's the support for understanding and then how it might be used. Focus student 3, how the student would be supported to understand the feedback and how they would be supported to use the feedback. So this one's all about focusing each focus student to understand and to use the feedback. On 3, this is all about language functions. Explain and provide concrete examples for the extent to which your students were able to use or struggle to use language function, and then of course vocabulary, discourse, and syntax. And you can see this person broke this down. Language function, this first paragraph, then vocabulary is addressed, and you can see syntax and discourse are being described as well. You also see in there that there's a description about how students struggled to use or were able to use as well. You can see the words struggles, were able to use, so you want to address both of those. In 4, this is about your analysis of next steps, the whole class and 3 focus students. First paragraph's all about whole class. Next paragraph starts with student 1, and then follows with student 2 and describes the further instruction. Student 3 it follows, and then particular students to end. And for B, explain how these next steps follow from your analysis of student learning, and then using principles from research and or theory. And so very specifically addressing their analysis, from my analysis, and then connecting theory throughout for next steps, and then a bibliography at the end. So this exemplar is strong. Remember, you want to pay attention to how you make your responses specific to the prompts, and you want to be using key terms throughout your responses too, to make it all tie together. Let's go back up to the top. This is a workbook on Literacy Assessment Task 3, the commentary. And I've given you every single one of the prompts, and I've given you support materials, both in ideas and in starters. I do hope that this will be helpful to you and that you will be successful on your TPA.